Welcome to our second class of our third year. Now we're going to, last month was a lot of review and talk about what we had planned over the summer, but we're getting back to content and curriculum this month, and we are so excited and honored to have Dr. Arnie Eisen join us. I included his bio. He's the former chancellor of JDS. Hopefully, many of you have had a chance to meet with him before. He's spoken at our Women's League conventions and at other events. And we are so glad that he's here to talk with us tonight about the conservative movement. So I'm gonna, actually, we'll go ahead and start with our blessing, and I will just lead that, and then we'll jump into content. So we'll start our lesson tonight. Baruch atah Adonai. I haven't shared it yet, have I? I'm sorry. Hang on. Trying to do too many things at once. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I will stop this. And now I'm going to put in the chat for you the questions that, if I can copy them in there, hang on. Okay, here we go. So these are the questions that we had asked you to think about for class, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Eisen. You have to unmute.
Okay, unmuted. Well, hi, everybody. So this is really fun for me to be teaching you all again. And the topic is obviously one that I am very personally engaged with, even more so than you might have known. I mean, you knew that I am a lifelong conservative Jew, and obviously was head of JTS. I have been engaged since I stepped down as chancellor. I'm just finishing a manuscript. I wrote a book of personal theology. So for 2 years, I haven't thought about what other people think about Judaism. I've been focusing on what I think about Judaism and about God and relationship to God and mitzvot. And so, as it were, I'm inside the questions that Ismar Shorsh was dealing with when he wrote his cluster essay. The second reason is, you may know, I'll hold it up for show and tell, while I was chancellor, I wrote a booklet. It's longer than the cluster, but it's the same idea. I wrote my personal statement of what I think conservative Judaism is about. It's called Conservative Judaism Today and Tomorrow. This is an advertisement. I don't make any money when these booklets are received or sold, but you can get them from JTS, Department of Community Engagement. So I'm inside the process, and I'm trying to get you inside the process as well. That's why I asked the question that I did. If someone asked you, well, what is Judaism and how is it different from other traditions? And you had 500 words or less, or a couple thousand words or less, where would you start? And if someone then asked you, well, how is conservative Judaism different than other kinds of Judaism? What would you say? And I noticed that the very first choice that I think Ismar Shorsh made, I can tell you this from experience, was he didn't talk about what conservative Judaism is not. He talked about what conservative Judaism is. I can tell you that whenever I went to a synagogue and I started out by talking about Orthodoxy and Reform, people said, why can't you just talk about conservative Judaism? Why do you have to talk about it in comparison to Orthodoxy and Reform? But whenever I started the other way and started talking about conservative Judaism, they would say, well, why can't you tell us how we're different from Reform and how we're different from Orthodoxy? And the questions come naturally because, as you know, and Chancellor Schorsch alluded to this in his essay, conservative Judaism began at a conference of reform-minded rabbis in the 1850s in Germany, where one rabbi named Zachariah Frankel walked out of the room. And Chancellor Schorsch reminds you, as I do in my essay, about why he walked out of the room. It was not about God, and it was not about halakha, it was about Hebrew. Because the reform movement was going to decide that Hebrew was completely optional for prayer. God, after all, understands all the languages there are, so God doesn't need to have you Hebrew. And they thought, therefore, we can do without Hebrew too. And Frankel said, no, because we are not just a universal religious tradition, we are Jews. And so Rabbi Schorsch points to this as important because in his understanding of Judaism, as you see, of conservative Judaism, one of the things that distinguishes conservative Judaism is that we are not just a religious tradition, we are a people, or as he calls it, a polity. And therefore, he chose to focus on what conservative Judaism is. And from the very beginning, from that very first page, he does not focus on this is what we believe about God as opposed to other people, what they believe about God, or this is what we believe about Revelation or Messiah or the creation of the world. No, he starts off, it's quite remarkable. I'm sure this jumped out at you. He starts off with Hebrew and Israel and the Jewish people. And so one of the things that distinguishes conservative Judaism, he says, is that it is also about that. And I would say, if I had to talk about what distinguishes Judaism, my first question to you, I taught for 6 years at Columbia in the Department of Religion, and I taught for 20 years at Stanford in the Department of Religious Studies. And I would say straight off that what distinguishes our tradition from other traditions is that our founding event, the founding story of the Jewish religion, the Jewish religious tradition, is also a founding event of the Jewish people. At Sinai, you don't just have a covenant with God, you have a covenant among Israelites. You have the creation of a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So from the very beginning, Judaism is not just about a religion, and therefore it's not just about beliefs or even about how you put those beliefs into practice. It's about a people and the life of a people. And so the first choice that I think Rabbi Schorsch made was to emphasize that by starting off his cluster of 7, not at the end with God, but with Israel, of all things, with the state of Israel, and with Hebrew, and with the Jewish people, which catches your attention immediately and say, aha, wow, this conservative Judaism is not like other religions that I've heard about, and may not be like other kinds of Judaism that I've heard about, but this is what conservative Judaism is to Rabbi Schorsch. And I'll show you at the end what I did when I had divided up my essay into a similar number of chapters. I have 8, what I did as opposed to what he did. But I want to start with one little bit of historical background that I know was in Rabbi Schorsch's mind. It was certainly in my mind. Anybody who writes about conservative Judaism, especially if you're the chancellor of JTS, has Solomon Schechter in front of you. And Solomon Schechter made several key statements on this point about what Judaism is, what distinguishes Judaism. And as you may know, that Solomon Schechter was never a card-carrying member of the conservative movement, even though he was the chancellor of JTS and was one of the founders of the United Synagogue. Schechter never thought of himself as founding a particular kind of Judaism. He thought he was representing the Judaism what he called Catholic Israel. This is authentic Judaism throughout the generations, updated for our time. So there are 2 books that Schechter wrote that are really relevant here. The first one is he wrote a book called Aspects of Rabbinic Theology. I've read this book so many times, the cover has long since vanished. But I wanted to share with you a couple of the thoughts that Schechter has in the introduction. He says, for example, the old rabbis seem to have thought that the true health of a religion is to have a theology without being aware of it. Have a theology without being aware of it. And thus, they hardly ever made, nor could they make, any attempt to work towards working their theology into a formal system or giving us a full exposition of it. So he called this book Aspects of Rabbinic Theology. It's a series of thoughts that the rabbis had about God, but not so much about God, because Jews don't talk as much about God as they do about our relationship to God, our responsibilities, our obligations. And here's Schechter writing a book of theology. And in the first introduction, he tells you, well, Jews don't really do theology the same way other traditions do, and never did. And he uses these words, systematic for what we don't do, or formal for what we don't do, or full exposition. You just don't have many books like that. So Maimonides is the exception that proves the rule. And Schechter was not about to violate those rules. All that these fragments, he says, can offer us are some aspects of the theology of the rabbis, which may again be modified by other aspects, giving us another side of the same subject. What we can obtain resembles rather a complicated arrangement of theological checks and balances than anything which the modern divine religious thinker would deign to call a consistent scheme of salvation. So there's no consistent scheme of salvation. There's nothing, according to Schechter in Judaism, which says, believe this and you'll be saved, or do this and God will love you, right? Instead, there are fragments, and it's not coincidence that Rabbi Neil Gilman, whom we are all channeling here this evening, when we're talking about beliefs of conservative Judaism, Gilman called his book Sacred Fragments. You don't write a consistent theology. And when I set out 2 years ago to write my personal theology, the first decision I made was, I'm going to be personal, and I'm not going to try to be systematic, because that's not what Jews do. And that's, I think, behind the title and the organization of Rabbi Schorsch's book. He's giving you a cluster. And they're a cluster of what he calls values. These are not philosophies. These are not just principles even. The distinguishing feature of values is that they're guides to practice. They're things that we hold dear. They make us worthwhile. We revere them, and we try to put them into practice. So he's following Schechter's example when he did that. I want to give you a couple quotes now from the volume of addresses that's published in this lovely book, Seminary Addresses, which you can still get on Amazon. If you have not read these, they're fascinating. Schechter was a beautiful writer. Some people think his wife Matilda was actually the stylist in the family, and that she's responsible for the prose. We don't know. At least I don't know. But the essays are beautifully written, and they're full of great thoughts. So here I just want to share a couple things with you from this. First of all, from the volume which Schechter is trying to, he called it the Charter of the Seminary. It's his inaugural address. He's just come to JTS. He's just being inaugurated as the president of the newly constituted seminary in 1902. And he says, you may have heard me quote this, I love this passage. You must not think, he says, to all the assembled greats of New York in 1902, you must not think that our intention is to convert this school of learning into a drill ground where young men will be forced into a certain groove of thinking, or rather not thinking. And after being equipped with a few devotional texts and supplied with certain catchwords, will be let loose upon the unsuspecting public to proclaim their own virtues and the infallibility of their masters. Nothing is further from our thoughts. I once heard a friend of mine exclaim angrily to a pupil, "Sir, How dare you always agree with me? I do not even profess to agree with myself always. Schechter did not want students to always agree with him. The point of conservative Judaism is not to have us all agree on everything. That's not what it's about. So the question then is raised, well, what is it about, right? And that's where you get inside the dilemma that Rabbi Schorch had when he was asked to make a statement like this, a rather short statement of what it is that animates conservative Jews, what sets conservative Jews apart. There's one more paragraph from this that I want to share with you, and then we'll get into Schorch. In 1903, Schechter gave an essay, which I think is one of the most important in the history of conservative Judaism, and it's really a landmark, certainly for conservative Judaism. It's called The Seminary as Witness. The Seminary as Witness. And the way he sets up this statement, he sets it up by talking about how different Maimonides was from Rashi. And he does this with a little bit of tongue in cheek. You know, the one, Maimonides, was a thorough Aristotelian and possessed of all the culture of his day. The other, Rashi, was an exclusively rabbinical scholar and hardly knew the name of Aristotle. The one, Maimonides, was all system and method. The other belonged to the great inarticulates. Can you imagine? I mean, Schechter is obviously smiling, if not laughing. Rashi, the greatest commentator the Jewish people has ever had on the Torah and the Talmud, is called one of the great inarticulates, right? So Schechter's making the point that our greatest commentator is not a systematic philosopher. He writes midrash, right? He does comments on particular verses. So then he says, what do they have in common? And this is the interesting thing. So now I'll try to go through this slowly. I thought of distributing it, but I'm not going to spend that much time on it. So what connected the students of Maimonides to the students of Rashi's? Okay, listen to this. As they both observed the same fasts and feasts. So the first thing that connects them is they have Shabbos together, and they have Passover together. They have Yom Kippur. They have the same fasts and feasts. As they both revered the same sacred symbols, though they put different interpretations on them. Right? So they both had the Torah, but they interpreted the Torah differently. They both have the shofar, but they don't have to agree on what the meaning of the shofar is. That's not why you have to go to shul on Rosh Hashanah to come out agreeing on what the shofar is, right? They both prayed in the same language, Hebrew. Right? Is Schorch's number 2. They both were devoted students of the same Torah. They studied the same Torah, though they often differed in its explanation. They both looked back to Israel's past. I would say they both looked back to the history of the Jewish people with admiration and reverence, though Maimonides' conception of the revelation, for instance, largely varied from that of Rashi. And their ultimate hopes, this is the final one, centered in the same redemption. In one word, they studied the Torah and lived in accordance with its laws, halacha, mitzvah, and both made the hopes of the Jewish nation their own. Both made the hopes of the Jewish nation their own. So for Schechter, what unites them is this shared peoplehood. They both look back with reverence to the same history, Jewish history, and they both shared the aspirations of the Jewish people. They looked forward to the Messiah. They looked forward to Israel's redemption. They prayed for the ingathering of the exiles. So they saw themselves as continuing a past and being a chain that leads to a future. That's what unites them. Now, if you've been paying careful attention, as I'm sure you have, you notice that one thing you would have expected to be in this list is not there. God is not mentioned in Schechter's list. Nothing is coincidence. Schechter did not, happen to forget to leave out God here. I have my own thoughts about this, but I think that he didn't want to start talking about God because he didn't want to go into the fact Maimonides, obviously, for those who studied Maimonides' belief system was very different from what Rashi believed about God. And yet they're both Jews. And Schechter did not, I think, want to start talking about what you have to believe to be a good Jew and what you can't believe to be a good Jew. Yeah, God is one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad. So God can't be three, but you can be a Kabbalist and believe that God has 10 different sfirot, and inside each sfirah, there's 10 different sfirot. So God has 100 sfirot. You can believe that, right? But Schechter wanted to avoid this whole question. He didn't want to make Judaism a matter of theology about God. So I'm looking at all this, I'm saying, wow, I know that Ismar Shorsh had this in mind, and it helps explain, to me at least, some of what he did and some of what he didn't do in this essay. So if you look at the very first page, Jill, you want to put up the first page of the Sacred Cluster?
There was just a question and some comments. Do you want to take that before we start in on that?
Let's do the first page and then start, and then stop, okay? Let me just finish this introductory piece and then we'll stop. So you see in the third paragraph there, 7 core values, and he gives you the line, the third line there, that we have receptivity to modernity balanced by a deep reverence for tradition. So you've got tradition and modernity there. Those are the catchwords. And then you've got a cluster, and he tells you they're 3 national and 3 religious, and they're joined to each other by the overarching presence of God, the ultimate core value, right? And he doesn't lay it out here, but as I said, if you go back to Sinai, right, the covenant with God is made simultaneously with a covenant with the Jewish people. And I would say there's a covenant with humanity as well, because God is the God of all the earth. But certainly the national and the religious come together there. And so you have Judaism, he says, has a dual nature as polity and piety. That's nice alliteration there. Polity and piety, and you get these 7. So now we have Israel as number 1, Hebrew as number 2, Klal Yisrael as number 3. And then, sort of on the other side of the luchot, of the tablets, you have the defining role of Torah, and you have the study of Torah, and you have halakha. And number 7, the crowning one, which he spends a lot of time on at the end, is belief in God, which Schechter did not have. And I think it's striking that Ismar had it, and I also have it in my statement about conservative Judaism. And we'll get to that, I hope, and we'll see exactly what he did with that. But you have a question, Julia?
So I think there was a question that Eileen had earlier. He said, would he, and I think Eileen, you were talking about Rabbi Shorsh, right? Would he write the same things if he were writing today?
Well, fortunately, my office is on the hall of 6th floor Brush, and Ismar's office is 3 doors down from me. So you could all ask him, or maybe I'll ask him in your name. I think he probably would. I mean, even more so than he did then. But he, how can you can't, I don't want to get us off on this topic, especially not at the very beginning, but we are all much more aware of anti-Semitism than we were 5 years ago. You can't talk about the future of the Judaism or the Jewish people without dealing with the fact that there is this spike in anti-Semitism again. And Israel is not any closer to peace, I think, in 2022 than it was in 1995 when Rabbi Shorsh wrote this piece, right? So he would still talk about the centrality of modern Israel, and he might want to underline it even more, because I'm looking at the faces in this room, and almost all of them are at least as old as I am. As you get away from our generation, engagement with Israel drops. It's very much a generational thing. So the generation, I was born in 1951, we are much closer to Israel than my children's generation, and they are closer to Israel than the generation now coming up. So I would say it's even more of a dilemma now. And Rabbi Shorsh, knowing who he is, would probably want to emphasize it even more now than he did in 1995. But that's just a guess of mine. You can ask him. isshorsh@jtsa.edu. I'm sure he'll respond.
And then there was just a comment, I think, when you were talking about your discussion on
Thank you.
Maimonides versus
Uh-huh.
Rashi, that there are no Jewish catechisms or dogmas.
Right. I mean, Maimonides, as I said, he's the exception that proves the rule. He tells you what you have to believe, and these beliefs are part of the Mishnah Torah, so they're part of halakha. So Maimonides tries to make this part of halakha, and of course, people didn't buy it. They rejected it. I mean, some people burned his books, but the point was he is an outlier. He does not speak for Judaism. So if you think about Judaism, and this is in my mind when I wrote my theology and my book about my booklet about conservative Judaism, the Torah does not give us one dogma. The Torah is not a catechism, right? It has lots of different things in it, lots of different. It has Leviticus as well as Deuteronomy. Those are two very different approaches. The Tanakh, I mean, this is the glory of Judaism, that we have the Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes and Job, as well as political theory in the book of Samuel, etc. So the Tanakh is not one voice, and the Talmud and the Midrash are certainly not one voice, and the Zohar is not one voice, and the prayer book, right? The prayer book is not one image of God. The prayer book is dozens and dozens of different images of God, and they're not consistent. So that's what's behind Schechter's thinking and Rabbi Schorsch's thinking and my thinking. So you can't base conservative Judaism on a catechism. He did not write a catechism. Instead, he tried to identify a set of values. And he never says, if you, as an individual, hold 5 of these values, but not all 7, you're not a conservative Jew. Now, this is his statement of what he thinks conservative Judaism is about, but no chancellor that I know of wants to impose their own vision of it on everybody else, right?
And now we have the law committee that's not one voice either.
It can't be, and that's why they have this crazy system of I'm calling it crazy, but it comes out of this, right? 6 votes, and you got a legitimate minority position, right? And JTS had to make a decision about ordaining gays and lesbians after a vote that was split down the middle, exactly down the middle of the law committee, right? So there you go. Should we go on? All right, let's go on now. So I want to say a few words about each of these, and I'll go through the first 3, and then I'll pause again for questions and comments. So you have the centrality of modern Israel. And that is, as I said, very striking to me. And he gives you a little bit of the history there. And he tells you that Heinrich Gretz, one of the founders of the positive historical school out of which conservative Judaism grew, inspired Moses Hess, who wrote one of the early texts about Zionism. And then he says, ironically, in the last paragraph, the state of Judaism is far healthier outside the Jewish state, where Judaism is indispensable for resilient Jewish identity. So Rabbi Schorsch, always has an eye for ironies, and you can't not, because history throws them up at you. So here you have, start at the end of that sentence. The Jewish state is a place where Judaism is indispensable for a resilient Jewish identity, and yet the state of Judaism is far healthier outside the Jewish state than it is inside the Jewish state, because, as you all know, you have a state-sponsored religious monopoly, which is Orthodox. And so, according to Rabbi Schorsch here, Judaism is pluralistic, the Torah is pluralistic, the Talmud is pluralistic, and the state of Israel, yes, although you can be a conservative or reform Jew there, you can be, you're not persecuted for it, but you're not assisted in the way, actually, you might say you are persecuted because you can't get married the way you want to get married, or divorced, or buried, et cetera, the way you might want to in a pluralistic system. So here we have the state of Israel, which is the #1 value in the cluster of conservative Judaism. And you can't not notice that conservative Judaism is disadvantaged in the state of Israel relative to other kinds of Judaism. So it's a kind of historical irony, and we're not going to distance ourselves from the state of Israel because of it. We're going to keep battling on behalf of the state of Israel, but on behalf of conservative Judaism inside the state of Israel. And this is these battles, neither of these battles is going to end anytime soon. Not the battle for Israel, not the battle for conservative Judaism inside Israel, but we're just going to have to fight both of them for a long time to come. Number two is controversial in the following way. I think that Rabbi Schorsch is absolutely correct. I think that Hebrew is irreplaceable and indispensable as a language of Jewish expression. And when you say that, you know that easily, 80%, 85%, 90% even of American Jews are not literate in Hebrew. So you're saying that there's an indispensable element of conservative Judaism which is foreign to the vast majority of conservative Jews. It's a battle that we have not won. It could be that you can't win it in diaspora. It could be that you can give people a foundation, like I got a good foundation, and then you go to Israel for a few years, and you go to an ulpan, or you place out of an ulpan, but you put yourself in a Hebrew-speaking environment, and then your Hebrew becomes fluent. And this is not just important for number one and number three. That is, number one being the state of Israel, and number three being the Jewish people. And that's why Hebrew is there as the linking element between those two. But it's important for your relationship to Judaism. And I would never say, he would never say, that if you don't have Hebrew, you can't have a live, full relationship to your Judaism, to your conservative Judaism. But it's so much richer when you understand the words on the page, word by word. I'll never forget, I was in a minyan that met in people's houses in California, as well as, we were all members of the conservative synagogue, which we also went to, but once a month we met in a living room. And there was a man there who was a sociologist, and in his 60s, he'd started studying Hebrew. And he started telling us about the first time he heard the Shema read from the Torah and understood the words one by one. He understood what the words meant. And he started crying as he was telling the story. And we all started crying as he was telling the story, because he was crying. Right? There's an immediacy of relationship to the tradition as well as to the people when you've got the Hebrew. And I think we have to face up to the fact that there are certain, let's call them disadvantages one has when one lives in a country with a powerful culture like America, where Jews are around 2% of the population, where a very small percentage of non-Orthodox Jews go to day school even. And even day schools, I hope I'm not disabusing anybody of mythology, but the day schools do not do a great job of teaching Hebrew that lasts for life. They have not conquered the Hebrew problem either. They do better. And Ramah, as you know, is not a solution to this problem. It tries. But you just can't get around the problem that we live in a very powerful culture that's the most dominant culture in the world, and it's an English-speaking culture. So if we were Europeans, we would speak 3 and 4 languages, but we're Americans. And so in general, we're going to speak one language. We can live 5 miles from Mexico on the border and not learn Spanish. And that's because it's the United States. And language is a problem. And I'm really glad that Ismar mentioned it. But you notice, Julia, in that second to last paragraph that begins, in a Jewish world, this is a call. Hebrew must emerge as the common and unifying language of the Jewish people. Nothing would advance that vision more effectively than to redefine Zionism today solely, this is incredible, redefine Zionism solely in terms of the ability to speak Hebrew. Wow. Zionism, according to this, would not be engagement with Israel necessarily or support for Israel, but ability to speak Hebrew, which would presumably carry along with it engagement with the place where Hebrew is the language of the land. And then he gives you another critique there, This is quintessential Ismar Shorsh. Jews who appreciate the centrality of Israel, then all the atavistic politics of the current Zionist establishment, atavistic politics, by which I think he means not so much Likud versus Labor as denunciations of diaspora. Rabbi Shorsh was very strong, as I tried to be, in denouncing denunciation of the diaspora in the name of Zionism. Pronouncements that would come out of Israel regularly, a little less now than before, but you still hear them, that diaspora is doomed, it has no future, and therefore, if you want to be Jewish, you should all be here. And he's calling that, I think, atavistic. All right, let's go to the third one, and then I'll pause again for questions. Devotion to the ideal of Klal Yisrael. So here we have not only a value, but an ideal, something that we should try to live up to. And he does make the point that of the three traditions, the three streams, conservative Judaism has always been the most Klal Yisrael minded, always, which is why we were, before the founding of the State of Israel, the most Zionist of the three movements. He says proudly that we are overrepresented, conservative Jews, on all sorts of Jewish Klal Yisrael organizations, like federations, lay and professional leadership, or JCCs, or Jewish studies professors, stuff like that. So here he's telling you an ideal, but he's also giving you an example of how conservative Jews live up to it. Schechter, as I mentioned very quickly, Schechter is famous for this notion of Catholic Israel. Catholic in the sense of broad, universal, inclusive. He didn't like to specify who was in and who was out. There are obviously some people that at the margins or beyond the margins who Schechter would not have included in his vision of Catholic Israel. But Schechter's instinct is to try to draw that boundary line as broadly as he can. So when Schechter founded the United Synagogue in 1913, look at that statement. Go on the web and find that statement, the founding address to the United Synagogue. You'll find that every time Schechter said conservative, he said or Orthodox, or conservative, or traditional. He founded a movement while not wanting to found a movement. He wanted to unify the Jewish people. He wanted to unify American Jewry around this central position. And I found that conservative Jews consistently wanted JTS to serve more than the conservative movement. They wanted it to serve the conservative movement, but they also wanted conservative Judaism to be broader than the conservative movement. You don't find Orthodox Jews or Reform Jews speaking the same way. I say this from experience and from survey data. You do not find Orthodox Jews say, oh, we're pluralistic about the nature of Judaism. No, they have Torah true Judaism. And Reform also does not speak generally, or historically did not speak this way about Klal Yisrael, but conservative Jews do. And so Ismar has this first cluster of Hebrew, Israel, and Klal Yisrael. All right, why don't I stop there and ask if there are questions at this point?
So question about whether it's whether reading and understanding ritual Hebrew would be enough, or that's not enough. You have to be able to speak the language to the people.
Yeah, I think he would prefer that, but because he wants it to be living, the state of Israel is living, and you've got half the Jewish people living there. But I think that if you said to him, well, I can't master spoken Hebrew, but I can understand the Hebrew of the Tanakh and the Hebrew of the prayer book, and I can even understand some of the Hebrew of the rabbis, he would be thrilled, and we'd all be thrilled. That would be a major achievement for a person. And honestly, I started learning Hebrew when I was a kid. And we all know that when you're a kid, you're like a sponge for language, and it's not fair. Like, you're much more able to soak up language as a kid than you are as a grown-up. So anybody that tries to learn Hebrew in their 50s, 60s, 70s, I just applaud them, and anything they can achieve is great. But you can't get it as easily as you can when you're a kid. So we recognize how hard this is. And the truth of the matter is, you go to Israel, that most of the Israelis you meet are going to speak English. And the minute they don't want to hear your Hebrew, like this is my experience. Even if my Hebrew is good, which it is, they don't want to hear my Hebrew. They want me to hear their English. So, we'll get by with English, but it's a problem. And it means that the relationship between American Jews and Israelis is often one way, because they can speak English and we don't speak Hebrew. And you can't get
Because they
inside.
learn English as young kids in
Right,
school.
exactly. And we could learn Hebrew as young kids if our kids were in school, but like not all our kids are getting even a Hebrew school, let alone a summer camp or a day school. So it's not happening on this end.
Question, Eileen, did you have a question? No. Anyone else just raise hands or? Not yet,
I
I
don't have
guess.
names. You see, if I had names, like, could I have names? But I can't call. I would, like, if my class was reacting, I'm teaching a class at JTS right now. Actually, they asked me to teach a class comparing Heschel and Mordechai Kaplan, which is total fun. And I have their names, obviously. So if I'm greeted by silence, I start calling on people, but I can't do that with you all. So I won't. I know people would leave the call, so I can't do that. But I urge you to. Chances are good if you have a question, somebody else has it. There's no such thing as a bad question. So feel free to ask.
There you go, Elisa.
Hi, can you hear me? I think I'm
Yes.
unmuted now. Hi, first of all, this is absolutely fascinating and I'm listening and trying to absorb everything. So I think maybe that's what people are doing. But a minute ago, you said that you felt like conservative Jews are overrepresented in a lot of positions. And
Not badly.
can you
I'm proud
hash
of
that
it.
out a little bit more? That was a really interesting thought.
I'm glad you
Thank
asked.
you.
I'm not complaining about the overrepresentation. In other words, we are 10, 12% of the American Jewish population. But if you look at federation boards or Jewish professionals who work at federations or at JCCs, there are a lot more conservative Jews than 10%. I mean, often a majority. And that's because if you soak up this conservative Jewish value of Klal Yisrael, you see yourself not as a denomination, but a member of the Jewish people. I think there's a second reason for it, which is that there are advantages sometimes to being in the center. So when I was saying Kaddish for my parents, I would sometimes go to an Orthodox shul and sometimes to a Reform shul, and I felt at home in both of them. But if I had been Reform, I would not have felt at home in the Orthodox, and vice versa, I believe. So there's something about the way we're educated that and who our friendship circles are. That what I was saying of feeling at home in the synagogue, conservative Jews have friends who are Orthodox. We have friends who are Reform, and friends who are conservative, and friends who are like unaffiliated, secular, like most Jews are. And so that's good for the Jewish people because it keeps us from stereotyping each other too much, which we tend to do.
That makes so much sense. And it almost reminds me of the concept of how our we had to become proficient in services because we couldn't own things generations ago. So it's almost this, it reminds me of that concept a little bit. I feel like we're a little bit more fluid and we walk in more circles.
That's right. The more circles
the way you're
you're
explaining
comfortable
it.
in, as long as you remember who you are, this is a very good thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Marlene
cool.
and then Marion.
Dr. Eisen, a pleasure. I think it's very interesting that you talked about this high representation of conservative Jews in leadership in Jewish community. Our synagogue congregation out of Israel in Cincinnati, we did a program on the 175 year almost history of our shul. And one of the closing PowerPoint squares was the list of Jewish Federation presidents, day school presidents, Jewish Vocational Service, other Jewish communal organizations, the Jewish Foundation, and how many of them were obviously not only from the conservative movement, but that happened to come from our synagogue.
Synagogue, right.
100 years. So it's not humble to toot our horn, but it was kind of very impressive when you had these lists of them and you saw that 3/4 or 80% the Jewish Day School and Federation and these smaller agencies, all, and more women, but more in them were all from our synagogue and from the conservative movement. So it was a point of honor for our,
But it also cuts both ways,
yeah,
because the minute someone gets active in their own synagogue, let's say, or their day school, they tend to get snatched up and become active in Federation. And so the national leadership of conservative Judaism has had to compete with Federation movement and JCC movement, et cetera, for leadership. And some really talented individuals have been lost to our own movement because of this service to the larger movement. So it's, you know, it's not always a zero-sum game. I don't want to make it sound like a zero-sum game, but it cuts both ways. And
you're absolutely right.
it has helped us as well as hurt us.
Thank you for pointing that
And
out.
also the money. So, you know, okay, I'm speaking now as the Chancellor Emeritus of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I wish the JTS and conservative institutions could get more of the conservative money that goes to Federation and Israel and Holocaust Museum, et cetera, et cetera. I'm proud of people for making those contributions, but I wish more of it stayed at home. And JTS does not get those contributions. So if we care about the future of the Jewish people, or care about the future of conservative Judaism, we've got to support these efforts. And they're not getting the support they need. So when people talk about the shrinking numbers of conservative Judaism, and they find all sorts of ideological reasons for this, to quote someone else, I say, follow the money. Follow the money. Where's the money going? You know what we could do if we had more money? So that's one more
Marion.
question, and then we'll go on.
I find we also, I'm from Toronto, Canada, and I find that we've lost some very good people to Federation. But my question was, if a woman or a man has the choice of learning Hebrew or Yiddish, they seem to want to learn Yiddish above is Hebrew. They will go for the Yiddish class.
That's interesting
Is
to me.
that something that you've come across?
I have not. And I'm not going to enter what was called the language wars that Jewish people had between the Hebrew and the Yiddish. It's surprising to me, but I think it's probably distinct to Canada, actually. But, you know, you can't know a whole lot of Yiddish without learning some Hebrew, too.
That's true.
All right, let's go back to the document. So now we're up to number 4. And it's interesting. So now we're at the top of the list on the other side of the page, as it were, the top of the other tablet. And of course, Torah is what defines Judaism. Torah is the highest value of Judaism. And he gives you a paragraph where he talks about the evidence for its importance. And then he says, he gives you a little critique of the triennial cycle of all things, and argues about the importance of studying Torah. And so, you know, you have to have Shabbat, the time, the home, etc., regulated by the Torah portion. I want to look in detail at this paragraph, Julia, that starts for conservative Jews. For conservative Jews, the Torah is no less sacred, if less central, than it was for their pre-modern ancestors. I use the word sacred advisedly. The Torah is the foundation text of Judaism, the apex of an inverted pyramid of infinite commentary, not because it is divine, but because it is sacred. That is, adopted by the Jewish people as its spiritual font. The term skirts the divisive and futile question of origins, the fetid swamp of heresy. Oh my God. So you know something's up here. So the fetid swamp of heresy is when some Jews accuse other Jews of being heretics because they don't share their view about the origin of Torah. But Rabbi Schorsch has packed an entire volume right here into this sentence. And if you want to unpack it, I urge you to read the book by my colleague from JTS, Benjamin Sommer, Sommer. I think it's called Scripture and Revelation in Judaism, or Scripture and Tradition. Rabbi Schorsch does not say that God wrote the Torah. In fact, he sort of tells you that he doesn't believe that, because he tells you the Torah has this value. It is our foundational text, not because it is divine. But I think if God had written the Torah, according to Rabbi Schorsch, that would be enough reason for it to be our foundational text, right? But because it is sacred. So what does sacred mean? Adopted by the Jewish people as its spiritual font. So a font is a fountain that gives birth to something. So the reason why the Torah is sacred is because it is the spiritual font of the Jewish people. The sense of individual obligation of being commanded does not derive from divine authorship, but communal consent. So notice, I'm reading very carefully. This is what I try to teach my students to do. And I think you agree with me that this essay is beautifully done. It's amazingly compact, and it is written really, really carefully. So it bears up under a close reader. Rabbi Schorsch does not say that there is not divine authorship. Remember, he wants to avoid the fetid swamp of heresy about origins. He does not say that it's not authored by God, but he says that its sacredness and the sense of obligation of being commanded does not derive from its authorship, but from communal consent. And this is Catholic Israel again. The Jewish people for 2,000 years has consented to be bound in obligation to the Torah. And some of us still do consent in that way. We still do regard ourselves as commanded, and we are therefore part of what Schechter would call Catholic Israel. The written Torah, no less than the oral Torah, reverberates with the divine human encounter, with a minimum of revelation and a maximum of interpretation, which I'm pretty sure is a quote from Heschel. Let's go back and see the notes. Yes, from God in Search of Man. So this is pure Heschel here. Heschel, some of you may have heard this before. I think it's chapter 20 of God in Search of Man. Heschel says, the Torah is not the word of God. The Torah is a midrash on the word of God. It's an incredibly powerful statement. The Torah, he says, comes with a minimum of revelation, a maximum of interpretation. The oral law is much larger than the written law. So even if God did write the Torah, we have to explain what it means. Somebody just told me the joke 2 days ago in shul. You know this joke about God says, thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk. And the Jew says, you mean I have to separate meat dishes from dairy dishes? And God says, thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk. And the Jew says, oh, you mean I can't have cheeseburgers? And God said, thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk. And the Jew says, oh, you mean chicken counts as meat? And God says, okay, have it your way. In other words, okay, you want to make all these regulations? I just gave you do not see the kid in its mother's milk, and you're going to go to town on it and have all these thousands of details. But that's what we do. That becomes Torah. So the written Torah reverberates with divine human encounter. So this is the claim here. And this is what Heschel says. This is what the theologian Franz Rosenzweig said. This is what Martin Buber said. I believe this. Benjamin Sommer believes this. Ismar Schorsch believes this, that the Torah comes about out of an encounter between human beings and the ultimate truth of existence. And you don't get divine dictation and take stenography. That's a legitimate view. That's what Heschel calls the Rabbi Akiva view of the authority of Torah, that God spoke it and Moses heard the words and wrote down the words. But that's not the Rabbi Ishmael view. And that's not Heschel or Rosenzweig or Buber or Schorsch or Eisen, all of whom share the view that there is an apprehension of the will of God somehow, and it's our job to translate that will into words and specific actions, what I call words and works. So this is what Ismar Schorsch has done here in this very short paragraph. It is a beautiful paragraph. You could spend a semester just studying this paragraph of the essay. I think this paragraph alone is a great achievement. I think the entire essay is a great achievement, but this particular paragraph is masterful. So then you have the study of Torah, and the study of Torah is crucial. Right? We have the virtue of Talmud Torah. And he says at the end of that paragraph, the first paragraph, the undogmatic preeminence of Torah spawned a textually based culture that prized creativity, individual creativity, and legitimate conflict. I just met a young Jew, like several weeks ago, who just discovered this for the first time and was thrilled that he's not asked to subscribe to some dogma. Like, this is not about dogma. And it doesn't stifle creativity, it opens creativity. And it doesn't stop conflict, it opens conflict. What does it mean? What does the Torah mean? What do we have to do? What conservative Judaism brings to this ancient, and by the way, and if you had to say what distinguishes Judaism from other religious traditions, that would be at the top of my list. The way we relate to scripture is unique. But then what conservative Judaism brings to this ancient and unfinished dialectic is a back and forth movement, right? Are the tools and perspectives of modern scholarship blended with traditional learning and empathy, right? So you go to a conservative synagogue and you have your Eitz Chaim, and your Eitz Chaim is drawing on Moshe Greenberg and Jacob Milgram and a whole bunch of other scholars. And you go to those scholars themselves, and you see that Jacob Milgram's Bible commentary on Leviticus or the book of Numbers cites the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who was a Christian. In other words, he's learning about Leviticus from studying an anthropologist, and her anthropological insights make it into his commentary on Leviticus, which becomes part of what we study as Jews in synagogue. That's conservative Judaism. And we would cite, and do cite, if you look at the Lev Shalem Sidur or the Lev Shalem Machzor in the left-hand margin, you will find quotations from Christians, certainly from all different kinds of Jews. I guarantee you that if you go to a Sidur or Machzor published by the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, you will not find conservative and reform, let alone Christian thinkers, represented there. Ezehu Hacham Halomed Mikol Hadam. Who is the wise person? One who learns from everyone. That's not conservative Judaism, that's Pirkei Avot. But that is a guiding mantra of conservative Judaism. So Judaism, he says, does not seek to limit our thinking, only our actions. So he made this fundamental distinction between what we have to agree on, which is halakha. You got to know if the chicken is kosher or if it's not kosher, because you have to know if you can eat it or not. But we don't have to agree on the meaning of kashrut. That's irrelevant to whether we can eat the chicken or not. So we agree on halakha, we disagree on agadah. And that's part of the way we study Torah and always have. So then he goes into the next core value, which is halakha. And I would say, as a person who did this same exercise, I had to think about this as chancellor. Maybe because mine was done, like 20 some years after Ismaris was done. I did not talk about halakha, I talked about mitzvah. Because halakha does not speak to the vast majority of conservative Jews today. Mitzvah does speak, and indeed the word mitzvah means something to the vast majority of Jews, let alone conservative Jews. I think halakha comes out of mitzvah. So therefore, when I had to have a section of my book, I talked about mitzvah, but Shorsh still talks about halakha. What you cannot not talk about is covenants. You look at that second paragraph, the first line in the second paragraph, collectively, the injunctions of Jewish law articulate Judaism's deep-seated sense of covenant, a partnership with the divine to finish the task of creation. Individually, the mitzvot accomplish different ends. Some serve to harness and focus human energy by forging a regimen made up of boundaries, standards, and rituals. To indulge in everything we are able to do does not necessarily enhance human happiness or well-being. Some mitzvot provide the definition and norms for the formation of a community, while others generate respites of holiness in which the feeling of God's nearness pervades and overwhelms. So then he goes and talks about Shabbat at length, as the Ten Commandments do, of course. But to me, again, if I had to pick out one sentence here, go back to the beginning of that paragraph, the injunctions of Jewish law articulate Judaism's deep-seated sense of covenant, a partnership with the divine to finish the task of creation. Partnership with the divine to finish the task of creation. So you can disagree, and of course we do disagree about what the divine is. I told you I'm teaching a course on Kaplan and Heschel. They both taught at JTS. They were worlds apart in what they thought God was. They disagree about that. But what they agree on is covenant, that Jews are obligated. Even Kaplan would say they're obligated. We have responsibilities to help the divine complete the work of creation. That's, to me, fundamental. That's why Heschel wrote a book called Man is Not Alone, another one called God in Search of Man. Why is God in search of human beings? Because God needs partners to the covenant. That's my reading of the Torah. That's Ismar Shorshit's reading of the Torah. That's fundamental to conservative Judaism. So people kept, everywhere I went, are we going to find a new name for conservative Judaism? I don't know. I don't know. We've got a brand here. It's recognized. It's not a great name, but people know what it is. The best candidate I've heard is David Wolpe's. He wants it to be covenantal Judaism because of the centrality of covenant to Judaism, certainly to conservative Judaism. I think he's absolutely right about that. It's covenantal Judaism. So where are we now in terms of time? We're getting there, but we still have some time for questions. I don't want to leave out God. So let's take some time for questions at this point, if there are any, and then we'll save a few minutes at the end. And Julia, tell me when we have 5 minutes for the end, and we'll get to God, okay?
Okay. So you talked about how we're in the middle, and you'd feel comfortable going to an Orthodox shul or to. Do you think that's true for a woman?
No. And that's one of the defining differences these days, and that is still the main boundary line. Gender in general, I mean, gay and lesbian stuff is also a dividing line at the moment. There are a lot of gay people who do not feel comfortable in Orthodox congregations because they know that they're tolerated, but it's on sufferance kind of. They're not like fully legitimate. So this is a dividing line. I think it's true to say for our culture right now, certainly for our politics, and it is divides conservative Judaism from others. But I don't know what's going to be, and it's a problem. It does not work for the unity of the Jewish people. So Israel should be a unifying factor, but Israel is often a dividing line, and we should be united, as a community that can worship together, but we can't worship together. So our JTS students, I shouldn't take time for this, but our JTS students had a retreat in Israel at a place, run by Mika Goodman, whose operation is basically on the West Bank. So our rabbinical students didn't want to deal with him on the West Bank, so they didn't go to the West Bank. So we moved it to the Jerusalem forest. So you come time to pray, and he says, okay, why don't you experiment? Let's do an experiment where it's only men who can do it. Let's just try this out. And they said, no, why don't you do an experiment where women can lead it? And he wouldn't do that. So they had this, they couldn't pray together. They couldn't pray together. And that's the situation of Jews today. We have to either make compromises or we can't pray together.
Geraldine, do you want to ask about the book? Is that what you were asking? Okay.
You could ask.
She just wanted to know which the book by Benjamin Summer that you had mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's called something like Scripture and Tradition, or Scripture and Revelation, something like that. It came out about 3 years ago.
Okay, she says that she was recommended to read The Bodies of God in the World of Ancient Israel.
That's his first book. which is also interesting. But the book that I was talking about is the second one.
Okay, thank you. Did you have something else, Sherilyn, too?
No, but thank you very much.
Okay.
I realize how much I have to learn. He's on a roll. Okay.
So I'll just share with you that when I wrote my little book, here's the table of contents. I won't ask you to read these little letters. I started with covenant, number 1. Community is number 2. Peoplehood in Israel is number 3. So it's a similar move to Ismar Shorsh, except I didn't put covenant at the end and then tell you how important it is. I put it at the beginning, and out of covenant, I went first of all to community and Israel and peoplehood, and then learning, and then mitzvah. Because learning leads to mitzvah. And then I have a section on tefillah and synagogue, and that's where I treat God. So in other words, I'm not talking about God, I'm talking about the way that Jews encounter God. So I called my section tefillah and synagogue, and then I have sections Jews and others and denominations in Judaism. So it's very similar, but the key to me again is if I had to say one way in which conservative Judaism differs from other forms, it's about learning, how we study Torah, what we do with Torah. That distinguishes us. One more question before we... Anyone? All right, well, gives us more time for God then. So look at, I was surprised that he called it belief in God, but I think that's the way people understand it. I come at last to the 7th and most basic core value of conservative Judaism, it's belief in God. It is this value which plants the religious nationalism and national religion. They're inseparable from Judaism in the universal soil of monotheism. That's quite a sentence, isn't it? Plants the religious nationalism and national religion that are inseparable from Judaism in the universal soil of monotheism. Remove God, the object of Israel's millennial quest, and the rest will soon unravel. But this is precisely what conservative Judaism refused to do. And then he gives you Heschel. So I think that second sentence, it is this value which plants. I think that's a very difficult sentence. And I understand it as a reference to chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, the line about covenant. So when God makes a covenant with his people at Sinai, the people make a covenant with one another at Sinai. So you have a religious nationalism and a national religion, and they're planted in the universal soil of monotheism because God says there, Ki li kol haaretz, all the earth is mine, God says. So God announces at the moment that God makes a covenant with Israel, that God is the God of all the world. And this distinguishes our Torah from the very beginning, from pagan religions, where God is the God of some nation or some land. And this God, from the very outset, we don't know if, okay, biblical authors might say that text is, who knows when Exodus 19 was written, et cetera, but from the outset, from the Torah, God is God of all the world. And notice you have Heschel here, and then you have more Heschel. For Judaism, then, God is a felt presence rather than a visible form. You can't see God. You can't depict God sculpturally. God is a voice rather than a vision. Revelation tends to be auditory and not a visual experience. God is both remote and nearby, transcendent and immanent. To do justice to our head and heart, that is to say, the whole person, Judaism has never vitiated the polarity that lies in the midst of its monotheistic faith. If you've heard Ismar Shorsh speak, you've heard this word polarities. He likes this word. Judaism says both and. God is transcendent. God is immanent, both beyond the world and in the world. God is nearby. God is distant. God is hidden. God is revealed. God is a presence. God is a creator figure. So, and then he turns to the prayer book, right? Which is a good move. That instead of writing theologically with Maimonides or some other, he goes to the prayer book and he says, okay, look what the prayer book says about God, and he shows you the variety of attributes or actions for which we praise God, Baruch She'amar. What I find striking and altogether typical of Judaism is the crescendo of appellations for God through a preference for circuitous verb forms. Verb forms. Despite a fervent desire to encounter and behold God, there is a palpable reluctance to depict or render God concrete, to traduce the mystery, to be traitorous to the mystery. The author takes refuge in verbs rather than nouns. See, and theology likes nouns or adjectives, predicates. God is X or God is Y. But Judaism prefers verbs. God does this. Again, if I had to imagine that there's a text from the Torah that's in back of this paragraph, it's the point that where Moses goes back to Mount Sinai after the golden calf, and God says, well, you can't see me, but you can see my back, right? It's incredible. After they're punished for making a golden calf, the text uses this incredible anthropomorphic image of God's back. So what is God's back? God's back, I think, most people think, most commentators, is the evidence of where God has been. What is where God has been? God's actions. So we know God we know God's presence by what God does. You don't see God. Occasionally you might get an auditory experience of hearing a revelation, but what you get is a set of actions, and the Baruch She'amar, the one who spoke and acted, the one who ordered and executed, the one who has compassion for all the earth, etc., etc. Theology compels us to turn verbs into nouns, but we Jews know God not through appearance, but effect. Only the experience of divine action falls within our ken. Our author even forms an adverb, Bereshit, in the beginning, into a noun, and God rises before us as the maker of the beginning. Baruch Oseh Bereshit in Hebrew, right? So you know this word that begins the Torah does not really work grammatically because it doesn't mean beginning. It begins beginning of, but it's certainly not a noun. But here you have the maker of the beginning. Well, an unchanging, soaring, bodiless deity is also beyond human suffering. To counter the conclusion, the prayer immediately moves from creation to love. And Ismar also ends his section about God with these words about love, which I enjoyed very much because I'm on a campaign to have rabbis and Jewish thinkers talk more about love, because I think we did not talk enough about love. Then he spends the next 2 pages with the conclusion. So I hope, I have nothing more to say about this. I think it's really a masterpiece, as I said before. And I hope that you'll all find time to, as we did today, do this with Chabrusa. Like, don't try to study it by yourself, but try to study it at least with one other person or in a small group, so you can see how it comes alive in conversation the way that we've just done it. Sorry, Julia, do we have time for final questions or comments? Or
Sure. We have one comment that says, related to the verbs, it said, like, we can't see the wind, we only see the effects of the wind, the waves
Lovely.
and the leaves. And
yes. And you can say the
Lillian.
same thing about the love, Go do an EKG or an MRI and find the love, right? You can't.
Lillian.
Yes, I wanted, when you were talking about money and how it's dispersed, and I was wondering why it's not, Jewish day schools are not possible for many, many people because of the extreme cost. And
Right.
that's where the kids could really learn to love Hebrew and learn the language and learn about Israel. And wanted your opinion on that.
So it's what's incontrovertible is that day schools cannot be supported by the parents or grandparents alone. The resources are not there in the parent body or the grandparent body of the student population to support the day schools. So day schools have to be a responsibility of the Jewish community. And the Jewish community, up until this point, has not responded positively to supporting day schools. It doesn't give it the support it needs. And mainly, why is that? Well, most of the money in the Jewish community is not Orthodox, put it that way, right? Orthodox money tends to go to Orthodox institutions. And the vast majority of major donors to federations do not have their children or grandchildren in day schools. So they're not inclined to support them. And you can make the case all you want that the future of the Jewish people depends upon training leadership in day schools, which I think is true, 100%. I made this speech many times. JTS is like a day school, right? For older students. So our community is not doing what it needs to do to secure its own future. That's sad but true.
Sadly.
Yeah, sadly, exactly right.
There was a big debate here a little while back because the Catholic schools are all subsidized by the diocese, and they're, there's still a cost, but it's
Right.
much less than the day schools because they have that institutional support.
And they're not paying their faculty as well, as we want to pay our faculty. There are all sorts of reasons. And we build art studios and science labs, et cetera, because we want to compete with the best public and private schools to get the Jews to send their kids there. It's a whole complicated thing, but you're right. So Rabbi Schwartz could have talked about this. He does talk about Camp Ramah at some length, but he was very active and is very active in supporting Schechter schools, right?
Marlene?
Hi, I know it's completely out of order, but it's something that just jumped out at me, and we could talk about it at another time. In the piece in the very beginning, there was reference to the fact that conservative Jews, some of us, are following the triennial cycle.
Yeah.
Reading. And it said making a sham of Simchas Torah. And since we just celebrated this holiday, I was wondering if you could just provide a little insight into that. Thanks. I'm sure.
See, there are two different ways of doing the triennial cycle. I also puzzled over that passage. So one of the ways, which is the way that most synagogues in the conservative movement do it, is you read a third of each portion as it goes around the cycle. So you still keep with the cycle, you just only read a third of the portion. And then over the 3 years, you complete the whole Torah. So in that case, you're not making a sham of it because you're completing the Torah, Simchas Torah, and then starting again with Bereshit, right? The way that you mess it up is if you go through the Torah every 3 years. So you spend 3 Shabbatot on Bereshit, and then 3 Shabbatot on Noach, and then 3, et cetera, et cetera. So you're really not finishing the Torah cycle every year, but I don't know many places that do that. So it could be that when he wrote the essay, there were places doing that, and he's campaigning against it.
Thank you. That was very insightful because I just did.
Right.
It just jumped out at me. Thank you.
Yeah, but I love, studying Torah. What greater joy is there? It's such a, it's it's a source of incomparable joy to study the Torah.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Usually the best questions are asked when people are walking out the door. I find in a class. And that means that if they're hard questions, I can use the excuse that I don't have time to answer them, which is great.
My goodness.
No one wants to ask the hard question that I won't have time to answer?
Okay, just want to know.
Go ahead, whoever it is.
The one about the triennial. We do it in our shul, and yet another shul that we were going to merge with, but we're not, is so against it. Why?
Because to some people, they want to take a 45-minute chunk of the service or whatever it is and spend that time in Torah study. So there are congregants, look around the room, do a little sociology next week and see how many people are actually studying the Torah portion or listening to the Torah being read. Other people are staring into space and meditating or whatever, but people like that. So, opinions differ about which way we should go on that. I can understand both sides of that. What a lot of synagogues have done, by the way, maybe your synagogue does this, is they have Torah study either before services or even during services. And there are people who come to Torah study and then go home because they don't want to do the prayer, right? They're not into tefillah. Fine. There are also people who, I was at a conservative synagogue where they do Torah study during the service, which means that instead of hearing the Torah read, they're having a 45-minute Torah discussion, which serves the same purpose.
Okay.
But you miss all the
And
boring
yes.
mitzvah stuff, which some people are happy to miss.
This is not a question. This is just a comment. This sentence about the undogmatic preeminence of Torah spawned a textually based culture. I am a Jew by choice, and I was raised Catholic, and the difference between the two is so striking still to me, because I like the idea that I'm allowed to think and use my brain, and when I read Torah, I interpret it. The way I interpret it is a way for me to live my life,
Exactly.
and I'm allowed to do that. So this is one of the things. And when I was thinking about converting, I thought about Reform, and I knew I couldn't do Orthodox, but I wanted something that was going to maintain. I wanted Hebrew. I wanted something that would maintain some tradition, but still allow me to use my brain. And this was it.
Yeah, exactly. So you go to a Catholic mass and you have a reading from the Old Testament, a reading from the New Testament, and those are selected readings. But the priest is not going to stand up there and say, okay, there are 5 different interpretations about what this reading means.
No.
And that's fundamental to Judaism. So
Right.
it's mythic in my mind. So I had the experience, luckily, as a teenager, where I went to a Hebrew high school after public school, Gratz College in Philadelphia, and we're reading the Torah in the original Hebrew with commentaries by Rashi and Ramban and others in the original Hebrew at the age of 14 or 15, and they're disagreeing with each other. You know what that's like as a 14 or 15-year-old, to see these great scholars disagreeing with each other about. So you get the point, which I'm glad you're now part of. It's an invitation to you. Okay, you have a seat at the table now. Come up with a new interpretation of what this means, which is what Jewish feminists had to do.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so come up with a new interpretation, and you're invited. Join the party.
Yeah.
And get that at the age of 14 or 15, or as an adult, or I could go on like this forever. But here's another memory in my mind, which will never leave me. I was at a conference of conservative Jewish educators and rabbis. We're talking about learning, and I said that if I believed that God commanded Moses to tell the Israelites to go kill those Midianite women and children, I would have a problem with God. But I don't believe that God is dictating the Torah. I don't believe that those are God's words. So I don't have a theological problem. This was a revelation for this person, that he wasn't being asked to believe that about God. This was some person, some Jewish, out of an encounter with God. This was the best of their thinking. This was the tradition they had, that their God would so abhor the Midianites that God would command Moses to command Israelites to kill Midianite women and children. But that's not God for me. And so I'm liberated from that problem. I have other problems, because how do I know what I should listen to and what I should not listen to? Like, why do I listen to justice you shall pursue, and not listen to the command to go kill the Midianite women and children? How do I know that one of them you know, is authentic and one of them is not. So that's,
Right.
but I'd rather have that problem. And that
Yeah.
to me is conservative Judaism.
Yeah, it was easy just to not think, basically.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Julia, I think we're at the end, yeah?
I think so. Just one comment of from Jill Tomar, who also graduated from Graz. So she just put that in there. Thank you so much for joining us
Pleasure.
tonight. We really appreciated talking with you again and
Pleasure.
learning with you. And it was just, you know, we've been focusing a lot on views of God and on parts of the service throughout the course. And so to hear about the origins of the movement and where we are, where we need to go, I think has been, and I think whoever mentioned it is right. Everybody's just thinking a lot about this. So some might be hard to come up with the questions, but thank you. And if you'll stay at the end for a little bit so we can talk to you. And just for everybody else, a couple of announcements. Our next class, I think, is November 10th. I looked it up. I put that on the email. For those of you, and I thank all of you who responded to Rabbi Sala's survey about learning trope. And she has classes and she will be in touch with you soon. I think she had divided them up and I know she wants to get started on that. So that will be moving forward. Ellen, anything else? You're muted. Ellen, you're on mute.
Okay, let's move it around. Thank you very much, Chancellor. I think there you are across the room. I'm still sitting here looking at the verb forms. That's the English teacher in me, and looking at the emergence of the changes in the appearance or non-appearance or presence of God through the various verb forms. And I haven't formulated a question yet, but I know if I had a little more time, I may still send you one because I'm trying to figure out what I'm noticing here in the transition from the first one. I know this is not what Julia expected, but this is one of your questions at the end because that's the way I process. But I think there's something very interesting here. They're not pure verb forms, and it was said circuitous forms, but there's a lot more going on here, and I have to work my way through that. It's a very interesting.
We all do.
Yeah, I like to deconstruct that way.
Yeah.
So thank
great.
you.
Sure.
This was really, it was a very nice placement to have you tonight because as Julia was saying, you really were able to bring a lot of the things that we have encountered through these 3 years. We're at the beginning of the third year. You've clarified and crystallized certainly some of these things as far as what we have been processing or attempting to process. So thank you.
Sure.
You have a lot of thank yous on here as well. So take a minute to read your comments and
Thank you.
thank you. Anybody else? If you have any further questions, we will send them on. Teachers love getting questions, right?
We learn from our questions. We don't
Right.
learn from hearing ourselves talk. We learn from our questions.
Well, and also both, I think, but it's part of being in the classroom, as many of us are teachers and know that. So thank you.
Sure.
And
Marlene?
I think,
Chancellor, you said it yourself from Pirkei Avot, who is wise, he or she who learns from all.
Yeah.
Right.
On the learning end too.
Yeah. Yeah.
so in light of all this, I think we'll go ahead and end with our Debbie Friedman Kaddish Rabbanan and wish you all a happy and early Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Leave, you can get off here. Just leave, because we're here.
Okay.
Just leave.
Oops.
What is this Kaddish Rabbanan here?
Or maybe, there we go. Can you hear it?
Not yet, Julia.
You can't hear it? Hold on. Make sure I got the sound in. No, it should be.
Sing it for us, Julia.
Oh, no. Not doing that. Okay, hold on.
Julia, I actually have a 9 o'clock meeting, so I'm gonna have to leave.
All right, thank
Okay.
you.
Good, bye.
Thank you.
Can you hear it now?
Yes.
For our teachers and their students and the students of the students, we ask for peace and loving kindness. For our teachers and their students and the students of the students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. And for those who study Torah here and everywhere, may they be blessed with all they need. And let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
That was a wonderful program.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen.